Just have to stop you there only because it looks like the members of the Senate Finance Committee are coming in. To start this hearing, it features Michael Froman, the U.S. Trade Representative. The topic, the trade policy of the Obama administration. This is going to be led by Senator Orrin Hatch, Republican of Utah. Here's the hearing.
The committee will come to order. Good morning. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to today's hearing on our nation's trade agenda. And I want to thank Ambassador Froman for taking time to be with us here today. With all the obligations he has, I have to say that the trade agenda is looking up since the last time you testified. Things seem to be improving with our ongoing trade negotiations. For example, while significant gaps remain, the administration seems to be inching ever closer toward a conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Morale at the Office of the United States Trade Representative, after a long period of decline, is beginning to rise. Of course, there's still a lot to be done, and renewal of Trade Promotion Authority, or TPA, is at the top of my list. But even in that regard, things seem to be looking up. Compared with this time last year, this administration is much more engaged at all levels in making the case for renewal of TPA. President Obama's strong call for TPA in the State of the Union was welcome, though in my opinion, it was long overdue. I hope that he'll follow his latest call to action with a real concerted effort to help us get TPA through Congress. Here in the Finance Committee, we're doing all we can to help in this effort. Although the bill I introduced last year with Chairman Camp and Baucus received broad support, I am currently working with Senator Wyden to see if there's a way to address some additional issues that he has raised. We're working with Chairman Ryan as well. And while there may be some improvements we can make to the bill, I want to make one thing clear. The time for TPA is now. TPA is how Congress tells the administration and our negotiating partners what a trade agreement must contain to be successfully enacted into law. And TPA empowers our negotiators to get the best deal possible for American workers. Now, to succeed in getting TPA renewed, we will need an all-out effort by the administration to make the case for why TPA is so vital to our nation's ability to fairly engage in international trade and to enhance the health of our own economy. Simply put, trade means jobs. Today, 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. These potential customers account for 92% of global economic growth and 80% of the world's purchasing power. To maintain a healthy economy, we need the opportunity to sell American products in these markets. Right now, the United States is engaged in some of the most ambitious trade negotiations in our nation's history. The first, which I already mentioned, is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Renewal of TPA is key to the success of this agreement. And without TPA, the administration will not be able to bring back the high standard agreement Congress needs to ensure its enactment. Let me be clear here. It would be a grave mistake for the administration to close TPP before Congress enacts TPA. Doing so may lead to doubt as to whether the U.S. could have gotten a better agreement, ultimately eroding support for TPP and jeopardizing its prospects for passage in Congress. There are also some key outstanding issues that need to be resolved in TPP. As I've stated in the past, my support for TPA by no means ensures that I will support just any version of TPP that happens to be submitted to Congress for approval. For me, the agreement must achieve a very high standard for the protection of intellectual property, including 12 years of data protection for biologics and strong copyright and trademark protections. The intellectual property provisions of TPP must also effectively address the theft of trade secrets and ensure effective implementation and enforcement of IP obligations. Provisions to enhance digital trade and address state-owned enterprises are also critical, as is real market access for U.S. exports. There are other major negotiations that are ongoing, and I am confident that renewal of TPA will help, would help, and will help in bringing those to successful conclusions as well. Most notably, there is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. TTIP must be a comprehensive agreement and include provisions on financial services regulation and strong investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. The agreement must also achieve a high level of IP protection and effectively address the systemic misuse of geographical indications to create market barriers. I'm also hopeful the administration will soon be able to conclude negotiations to update the Information Technology Agreement, and I expect we will see progress in advancing the negotiation of a Trade and Investment Services Agreement and an Environmental Goods Agreement. Ambassador Froman, all of this represents a very ambitious agenda for your office and for the administration as a whole. But if I haven't been clear up to now, let me restate. TPA must be considered an essential element for all of these endeavors. I believe congressional renewal of TPA will unleash new energy in our international trade agenda, helping to propel our economy to greater growth and prosperity. History shows that trade agreements concluded with TPA in place create new economic opportunities and, importantly, higher-paying American jobs. This year, we truly are at the precipice of opportunity. The only question is whether both parties in Congress and the administration can work together to put in place the necessary tools to seize this opportunity. I certainly think we can, and I will do everything in my power as chairman of this committee to ensure our mutual success. Ambassador Froman, I look forward to your testimony today and to working with you to advance a strong pro-growth trade agenda. I'd now like to turn it over to Senator Wyden for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Hatch, and it's good to be working with you and have the ambassador here. Today's global economy seems to move at 1,000,000 miles an hour, so clinging to yesterday's outdated trade policies is a loser for the millions of middle-class American workers counting on political leadership to create more high-skill, high-wage jobs. Trade agreements need to bulldoze the trade barriers and open new markets to exports made by America's middle class, the things we grow or raise, build or forge. Done right, trade agreements can help grow the paychecks of middle-class families. That can help take our economic recovery from a walk to a sprint. According to a report by the Commerce Department's International Trade Administration, many export-driven jobs, from precision welding to engineering design, offer higher pay and more generous benefits than jobs that are not tied to exports. American workers who design and build products like machinery, electrical gear, or transportation equipment can get into the winner's circle when the goods they make are exported. The goal of trade agreements should be to take the fruits of American labor and to ship them to markets around the world. That said, it is easy to understand why many American workers are frustrated when they haven't seen a meaningful pay raise in decades. Or worse, they've lost their job and fallen out of the middle class. When discouraged Americans argue they've been hurt by trade, those voices must not be ignored. Those voices have to be heard, and those who favor a trade agenda that takes on the challenges of a hyper-competitive global economy have a responsibility to make the case that it's going to work for the middle class. I'm raising that issue especially because the President said during the State of the Union address, and I quote, "Past trade deals haven't always lived up to the hype," unquote. So I'm looking forward to the ambassador outlining today how the administration plans to change that with fresh policies that are going to lift wages, help create middle-class jobs, and expand the winner's circle. It's also important to hear what safeguards are going to be in place to ensure that any workers impacted by trade have access to retraining, health coverage, and other sources of support that connect them to new opportunities. Briefly, I'm going to wrap up by mentioning 3 key issues. The first is there must be tough trade law enforcement. There's never been a greater need for the U.S. to back its workers and businesses by strongly enforcing our trade laws and agreements. And in the face of unfair schemes by foreign governments and companies that undercut our jobs and our exports, trade enforcement is essential. Just ask any one of the hundreds of workers who work in my state at Solar World, a solar panel manufacturer. When the Chinese made an end run around our trade laws that threatened Solar World and its employees, the company fought back and won. That victory preserves 900 good-paying Oregon jobs. And American trade enforcers have to keep at it, because China and other governments won't stop trying to get around the trade laws anytime soon. With 21st century trade agreements, tough enforcement also needs to hold foreign governments accountable for commitments to uphold strong labor rights and environmental protections. Those are bedrock elements of a trade agreement, and they cannot be ignored or pushed to the sidelines. The second issue to address is technology. Just as containers changed trade in the 20th century, the Internet is changing trade in the 21st, enabling more efficient ways to exchange goods and services internationally. 3 decades ago, an entrepreneur with big dreams in a town like Mount Vernon, Oregon, with a population of 500, didn't have the Internet as a tool to access global markets. Today, that entrepreneur does, and that access could be direct or through Internet platforms. The nation's trade policies must take advantage of economic areas where there is clearly advantage USA. That means promoting and protecting a free and open Internet, keeping open what is, in my view, the shipping lane of the 21st century. The last point I want to mention is transparency. The American people have made it clear they are not going to accept secretly written agreements that don't see the light of day until the very last minute. That was too often the way things worked in the past. It's not good enough anymore. Nor is it enough to respond to important questions with the same inadequate refrain that somehow, some way, people are going to benefit from trade deals. The American people have a right to know what's at stake in negotiations before they wrap up. Our trade policies are stronger when the American people are part of the debate and when their elected officials in Congress can conduct effective and vigorous oversight. Furthermore, transparency is also critical for a trade promotion authority bill. Once it's ready, that bill must be available to the public, and there has to be a fair and open process for its review and consideration, and Chairman Hatch and I have been discussing these and other issues. Finally, whatever a member of this committee feels with respect to trade, let's have a serious debate and work together on a bipartisan basis to find as much agreement as possible. My focus is going to be on finding new opportunities to sell red, white, and blue American goods overseas, helping our businesses create high-skill, high-wage jobs and growing paychecks for middle-class families. Chairman Hatch, thank you for the opportunity this morning to discuss these important issues. We're glad the ambassador's here, and I look forward to his views.
Well, thank you, Senator Wyden. We appreciate your work in this area, and we're highly hopeful we can continue to work in a bipartisan way to do this very important work. Well, we're so happy to have you here, Mr. Ambassador. I don't think you need an introduction beyond. We're very pleased to see you working in this area. We believe you're one of the best people we've had in this area, and we intend to work with you and try to make sure that we get this work done. But you come here with all the credentials and an awful lot of experience in this administration. So we're looking forward to working with you, and we'll turn the time over to you.
Well, thank you, Chairman Hatch, Ranking Member Wyden, members of the Finance Committee. Thanks for this opportunity to talk about the President's trade agenda. As a central part of the President's overall economic strategy, our trade agenda is committed to supporting more good jobs, promoting growth, and strengthening the American middle class. At USTR, we're advancing those goals by knocking down barriers to U.S. exports and leveling the playing field for American workers and businesses of all sizes. As we work to open markets around the world, we're
American people the truth. We know that the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been negotiated and secret for 5 years. You're trying to run
Let's have order.
To protect our
All right,
communities.
remove this
You're
person
not
from the
allowed
room.
to
And if
protect
anybody
our
else,
communities from
if anybody
foreign
else
workers.
does this, we're going to be.
You're not going to allow us to protect our workers from poor working conditions. You are not going to get fast track. The American people are against it. They're against the TPP. No secret trade deal.
We're saying stop fast track.
No TPP!
We don't want supersized NAFTA. We don't want
Remove these people.
losing our jobs. We don't want undermining the party with this fast tracking to Congress. We believe in democracy, not secrecy.
No
not
TPP.
transparency. We want transparency.
No TPP! No TPP! No TPP! No TPP! No TPP! No TPP! No TPP!
All right, let's take them out. It was just, now look, the committee will be in order. Comments from the audience are inappropriate. They're out of order. If there's any further disruption, the committee will recess until the police can restore order. And let me just say this. I understand that some people have strong feelings about the subject we're talking about today. That's fine. The First Amendment guarantees your right to express your views, but we have to allow civil discussion to occur in the context of this hearing. So for our people who are protesting, I ask that you respect the rights of others, respect this committee, and remain quiet so the hearing can continue. And we would appreciate having the signs removed as well. Show some courtesy here. But we're not going to put up with it, and if we have to recess this committee, we will, which would be a shame, but and we'll recess until order is restored. So let's have no more of that. And I ask our Capitol Hill Police to make sure that we don't have any more of this type of activity. Ambassador Froman, we turn the time back to you.
I'm a retired shipyard worker, and my job was shipped overseas, along with thousands of other Baltimore ships.
You're not representing your people properly. No, you're not. Take him out. You can.
You lie. That's a fraud. Big business, corporate secret deals, costing America jobs.
You're not helping your case. I can't help it. Okay. Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, as we work to open markets around the world,
If any signs go up again, we're going to throw you out of the meeting too. So let's just stop the cheap politics. Mr. Ambassador Froman.
Mr. Chairman, as we work to open markets around the world, we're enforcing our trade rights so that American workers, farmers, ranchers, and businesses get the full benefit of all the economic opportunities the United States has negotiated over the years. Taken together, these efforts have contributed greatly to America's economic comeback. Since 2009, America's total exports have grown by nearly 50% and contributed nearly 1/3 of our economic growth. And during the most recent year on record, 2013, U.S. exports reached a record high of $2.3 trillion and supported a record-breaking 11.3 million jobs. At a time when too many workers haven't seen their paychecks grow in much too long, these jobs typically pay up to 18% more on average than non-export related jobs. Over the past year, I've traveled around the country and heard many of the stories behind these statistics. I listened to small business owners in Colorado, Maryland, and Ohio, farmers and ranchers in Iowa and Wisconsin, manufacturers and service providers in Texas and the state of Washington, and many others. And across our country, I've heard the same resounding message: confidence that as long as the playing field is level, our workers and businesses can win. Today, more small businesses are exporting than ever before, and by tapping into global markets, these companies are able to increase their sales and their payrolls. And this success is all the more impressive when you consider that the United States is an open economy and other countries aren't necessarily playing by the same rules. That's why we're working harder than ever to bring home trade agreements that will unlock opportunities by eliminating barriers to U.S. exports, trade, and investment, while raising labor, environment, and other important standards across the board. If we sit on the sidelines, we'll be faced with a race to the bottom in global trade, not a race to the top. And as the President said last week, we should be the ones to engage and lead. That leadership is apparent in our work during the last year to advance the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. The contours of a final agreement are coming into focus, and we've made important progress in the market access negotiations and in addressing a number of 21st century issues, such as intellectual property, digital trade, competition with state-owned enterprises, and labor and environmental protections. At the November TPP leaders meeting, all 12 countries reaffirmed their commitment to concluding a comprehensive, high-standard agreement as soon as possible. Another promising area is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. With the new European Commission in place, the United States and the European Union are moving forward with a fresh start in the TTIP negotiations, which will build upon the $1 trillion in two-way annual trade. In November, President Obama and EU leaders reaffirmed their commitment to an ambitious, comprehensive, and high-standard TTIP agreement. At the World Trade Organization, the United States is working to conclude a WTO Information Technology Agreement expansion deal, which would cover roughly $1 trillion in trade, while moving forward in negotiations on the Trade and Services Agreement and the Environmental Goods Agreement. This will be a critical year for trade. We look forward to continuing our efforts to engage the public, stakeholders, and members of Congress in a robust discussion about how we're opening markets and creating opportunities for American exports, how we're raising labor and environmental standards to level the playing field for American workers, how we're promoting innovation and creativity, as well as access to its products, how we're ensuring that governments will be able to regulate in the public interest while giving Americans abroad the same kind of protections we guarantee domestic and foreign investors here at home. As we move ahead, we're committed to providing maximum transparency consistent with our ability to negotiate the best agreements possible. We look forward to working with this committee and others in Congress to determine the best way to achieve that goal. Mr. Chairman, there's no other area of policy that reflects closer coordination between the executive and Congress than trade policy. To further strengthen that cooperation, as the President made clear last week, we look to Congress to pass bipartisan trade promotion authority. TPA puts Congress in the driver's seat to define our negotiating objectives and strengthens congressional oversight by requiring consultations and transparency throughout the negotiating process. The previous TPA legislation was passed over a decade ago. An updated TPA bill is needed to address the rise of the digital economy, the increasing role of SOEs, and to reflect the latest congressional views on labor, environment, innovation, and access to medicines. TPA also establishes the timeline and process for the trade agreements we bring home to be reviewed not only by Congress, but also by the American people. TPA is Congress's best tool to ensure that there is ample time for public scrutiny and debate on U.S. trade agreements. And the administration looks forward to working with this committee and the new Congress as a whole to secure a TPA that has bipartisan support. We also look forward to working with Congress to renew a number of other programs, including trade adjustment assistance, the Generalized System of Preferences, which expired in 2013, and the AGOA program well before its expiration in September of this year. We can only accomplish these shared goals and priorities through strong bipartisan cooperation between Congress and the administration. Together, we can ensure that our trade policy continues unlocking opportunity for all Americans. Once again, thank you for the invitation to testify, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Last year, I expressed my profound disappointment that you refused to bring a WTO case against India for its continuing efforts to undermine U.S. intellectual property rights. High-level working groups and meetings are simply not good enough. I've long feared that if you did not act, more problems would emerge. Now, less than 2 weeks ago, India's patent office refused to grant a patent on an important drug that treats hepatitis C. Their rationale is based on a patentability standard that is out of step with the rest of the world and which many believe is inconsistent with India's obligations under the World Trade Organization. Now, would you express to us today your plan to take meaningful action against India's breaches of our various companies' intellectual property rights?
Well, we have we have been concerned about the deterioration of the innovation environment in India, and we have engaged with the new government since they came into office in May of last year about our concerns. We held the first trade policy forum in 4 years in November, and I just returned from India yesterday, as a matter of fact. And in all of these areas, we have laid out a work program with the government of India to address these and other outstanding issues. Recently, the government of India published a draft intellectual property rights policy proposal that is now open for public comment, and we are in the process of providing comments on that draft proposal, and we are committed to continuing to engage with them to underscore areas of work that needs to be done in copyright, in trade secrets, as well as in the area of patents. I believe we've got a good dialogue going now with the new government on this issue, and we're committed to working to achieve concrete progress in this area.
Well, I hope you'll follow up on that. China's leadership continues to pledge that the market will play a greater role in China's economy, yet the government continues to use law as an instrument of industrial policy. This is increasingly pronounced in the use of China's anti-monopoly law. Now, how will you ensure that China administers its anti-monopoly law in a non-discriminatory and transparent manner?
Well, this has been an area of strong interest of ours. At the recent Joint Commission on Commerce and Trade that we held, that Secretary Pritzker and I held with China in December, this was one of the issues very much on the agenda, and we've made some progress in moving ahead on the application of anti-monopoly law, which we think should be applied to deal with issues of competition, not issues of industrial policy. So we are engaged with them, as are our competition authorities at the Department of Justice and the FTC, to work to encourage them to apply the law as it's intended to be applied.
I know these are tough areas. Canada's creation of a heightened standard for patentability or for patentable utility for pharmaceutical patents is a serious problem for our U.S. innovators. This standard is inconsistent with other countries and undermines the ability of U.S. innovators to obtain and enforce patent rights in Canada. It is also inconsistent with Canada's obligations under the World Trade Organization and under the NAFTA. What are you doing to ensure Canada's patentability standards are consistent with its international obligations?
We have raised this concern directly and repeatedly with the Canadian authorities. That issue is now being litigated, and I believe the Canadian authorities are looking to see how it proceeds in litigation as we continue that dialogue with them.
Thank you. Ambassador Froman, in remarks last June, you highlighted data localization requirements as a significant problem for U.S. services companies. Now, some foreign governments require U.S. financial services providers to set up local data centers as a condition of doing business in their markets. New trade agreements need to fix this problem. Do you agree that it's important that all U.S. industries, including financial services providers, receive protection against data localization requirements in ongoing trade negotiations?
I do agree, and this is a key area right now in our TPP negotiations, where, as Ranking Member Wyden mentioned, the digital economy is playing an increasingly important role in trade. And we want to, through TPP, secure agreements and commitments to maintain the open flow of data cross-border so that our small businesses, for example, can be based here and sell into markets abroad, but also to ensure that there are not localization requirements which require the construction of redundant infrastructure, making companies build infrastructure in each country in which they want to service. So this is a key part of our TPP negotiations. We're making progress in that area, and we hope that will set a new standard for bringing trade rules into the digital economy.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to be strong on enforcing the 5-minute rule so everybody can have an opportunity here. Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, the President said in his State of the Union speech, and I quote here, "Past trade agreements haven't always lived up to the hype." And my sense is, based on my town hall meetings, and this has come up repeatedly, what middle-class families are going to ask is, so what's going to be different this time? I think it'd be helpful if you'd spell that out.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senator. Look, I think the President has made clear that as we pursue a new trade policy, we need to learn from the experiences of the past. And that's certainly what we're doing through TPP and the rest of our agenda. For example, when he was running for president, he said we ought to renegotiate NAFTA. And what that meant was to make labor and environment not side issues that weren't enforceable, but bring labor and environment in the core of the agreement and make them enforceable just like any other provision of the trade agreement, consistent with what Congress and the previous administration worked out in the so-called May 10th agreement. That's exactly what we're doing through TPP. There will be strong labor and environmental protections in the core of the agreement, and they will be fully enforceable, consistent with the rest of the agreement. And that's important because it's part of our effort to level the playing field, raising labor and environmental standards, as well as strengthening intellectual property rights standards and access to their products, creating new disciplines on the issues that are affecting real workers and real production right now, like state-owned enterprises. Right now, state-owned enterprises in other countries compete against our private firms on an unlevel playing field. TPP will put disciplines on state-owned enterprises for the first time and require those state-owned enterprises, if they're engaged in commercial activity, to act on a commercial basis. And also, as you mentioned, the digital economy, updating our trade agenda to reflect changes in the global economy. So in all of these areas, we're working to make sure, and we're trying to use every tool at our disposal in the trade negotiations to drive more production, more manufacturing to the United States, make the U.S. the production platform of choice.
Let's talk about transparency next, because I think this is another area where the public looks at the internet and says, hey, we can find out a lot of information that you couldn't have, for example, back when the trade deals were being discussed in the 1990s. So there has, of course, been a concern about transparency and the Trans-Pacific Partnership discussion. And the concern here is that the President would sign a TPP deal that would be protected by fast track, and then you'd have middle-class families saying, we don't know what's in it. Now, you and I have discussed this before, and I think it would be helpful if you could address the question of whether you expect the President to sign a Trans-Pacific deal before the agreement is made public for the American people to see.
Well, certainly in the past, the practice has been for it to be public before it's signed. That's our expectation here. We need to consult with our trading partners to understand what their processes and domestic constraints are, but we are beginning that consultation process with that expectation in mind.
Good. On the issue, again, looking at some of the sector-specific questions that you and I have discussed, there's a lot of concern with respect to dairy, and this is a very important issue in the Pacific Northwest, and we, of course, have both defensive and offensive interests with respect to dairy. For example, we may be willing to open our market to more dairy goods from Australia and New Zealand, but only if Japan and Canada's market is more open to our dairy products. How are you going to ensure that a Trans-Pacific Agreement on balance is a better deal than what the industry has now?
Well, whether it's dairy or our other agricultural commodities, we want to make sure TPP it creates additional opportunity for them. And that includes both market access, getting access to markets abroad like Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, Canada, and others. Also dealing with issues like sanitary and phytosanitary standards and making sure that other countries are applying SPS standards consistent with science. It also goes back to an issue that the chairman mentioned, geographical indications, making sure that we can sell our high-quality products from the United States and have their trademarks and the common names respected in other countries. So a package as a whole, we are working on to make sure that it benefits our dairy farmers, and the same thing could be said of our other commodity groups.
One last question, if I might, and it addresses what the President touched on with respect to China. I think the President basically said that if America isn't leading in writing the trade rules in the Asia-Pacific region, China will. With which countries in the Asian-Pacific area does China either seek or already have a trade agreement, and how specifically would those agreements disadvantage America's middle-class workers?
Well, my understanding that China has negotiated 14 FTAs since 2002, one with ASEAN, which is 10 countries in total, Australia, Chile, Costa Rica, Hong Kong, Iceland, Korea, Macau, New Zealand, Pakistan, Peru, Singapore, Switzerland, and Taiwan. And right now they're engaged in what's called the RCEP negotiations, which is 16 countries spanning from India all the way to Japan. I think what's important about this is these are the fastest growing markets of the world. Right now, there are about 570 million middle-class consumers in Asia. But that number is expected to grow to 2.7 billion over the next 15 years. And the question is, who's going to serve that market? Is it going to be made in America, grown in America products, or is it going to be products made by China or others? And what are the rules of the road for that region going to be? You know, the big difference between what we're doing in TPP and other trade agreements are things like raising labor and environmental standards, having strong intellectual property rights protection and commitments to access, putting disciplines on state-owned enterprises, bringing into the digital economy rules like the free flow of data and information that come from the real economy. Those types of disciplines don't exist in these other trade agreements, and that's why it's so important for American interests and American values that we be the ones who engage and lead to create a fair and level playing field to protect our workers and protect our jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Looks like China has a robust trade policy. Senator Grassley.
Yeah. First of all, I want to thank you for the number of times you've taken my telephone calls and given me updates on negotiations that we're talking about here. Having the opportunity to get updates is very important. Also, I want to, since you talk to the President probably more frequently than I do on trade, give a little bit of advice. I know that the President's very much a believer in trade and wants Trade Promotion Authority. I know he's mentioned it at least in the last 2 State of the Union messages to the Business Roundtable, to the Export Council. But I hope you'll tell him that if we're going to get Trade Promotion Authority passed, he's going to have to work the telephones one-on-one with some senators to get us to the 60-vote threshold. Now, I'm going to ask my first question a little bit along the lines of what you discussed with Senator Wyden. When you were at the Iowa State Fair with me last August, meeting with Iowa farmers, you stated, and I hope I'm quoting you accurately, that you would know a good deal for agriculture when you saw it, end of quote. And that was in regard to TPP. My question for you is very simple. How close do you think we are to seeing a good deal for agriculture with TPP? And more specifically related to pork, how are the market access negotiations with Japan going?
Well, thank you, Senator. We're making good progress in these market access areas, including on agriculture and including on pork. We're not done yet. We still have work to do with Japan and other countries. And we've been working very closely with our stakeholders in this area, the pork producers and others, to ensure that the package that we come up with addresses their concerns and creates real value for American farmers and American ranchers. So we're not done yet, but I feel confident that we're making good progress, and we hope to close out a very positive package soon.
Just to emphasize something from history as well as things I've related to you in the past, that for an overall agreement, whether it's manufacturing, services, or agriculture, it seems to be, at least from the part of the United States Senate, a good agriculture agreement tends to be the locomotive that brings along everything else, and I hope manufacturing and services will help along that line as well for their own good. Second, over the last year, we've seen China and the European Union continue to drag their feet on approvals of certain biotechnology traits. In some cases, market disruption developed from the lack of regulatory approvals. I know you have been working hard on these issues, but what else can we do to facilitate regulatory review processes throughout the world that are science-based regarding biotechnology?
Well, thank you, Senator. That's very much our perspective on this, is to encourage other countries to engage in SPS approvals based on science. Let me take the 2 examples you give separately. With regard to China, in the run-up to the JCCT in December, we had a series of dialogues with them about biotechnology. They approved 3 biotech events on the eve of the JCCT, and we have a commitment now to have a strategic agriculture policy working group co-chaired by USDA and ourselves on our side and various Chinese ministries on their side to work on the improvement of their overall process for biotech approvals. So not just the particular events, but how they can bring their process into conformity with international standards. With the EU, we're very much encouraging them to move ahead. We were disappointed that over the course of 2014, they didn't approve any biotech events. There's a backlog of biotech events that have been designated as safe by the European Food Safety Agency, and we're encouraging the new commission to take those up consistent with its WTO obligations and to approve those.
Yeah. I've had a number of U.S. companies visit with me about the need to address currency manipulation in TPP. Has that issue been raised in negotiations?
Well, this is an issue, as you know, of top importance to the administration, and we've been pursuing it from the president on down, directly with countries such as China, but also through the G7 and the G20 to IMF to encourage countries to move towards market-determined exchange rates. And I know you'll be seeing Secretary Liu here soon. He obviously has the lead on those issues. It's something that he and I are consulting on and continuing to engage with others about.
Is your answer that it's being negotiated with individual companies, countries from the president interest and your interest, and is that saying that what my question was referring to, that it's not being done through TPP negotiations, or is it being done through TPP negotiations? And that's my last question.
At this point, Secretary Liu, who obviously has the lead on this, has been having conversations in the context of these other mechanisms bilaterally and with the G7, the G20, and the IMF.
Okay, but not through TPP. Thank you.
Senator Schumer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Wyden. Ambassador, I think you know what I'm going to say, but I'm going to keep saying it until the administration actually hears me. I appreciate the value of our engagement in the Asia-Pacific region through TPP. However, I'm skeptical about supporting another trade deal based on the results of our existing agreements. To me, the #1 issue facing America is that middle-class incomes are shrinking. So people can say these trade agreements grow GDP. These trade agreements help corporate profits. But if they can't show they're going to help middle-class incomes increase when all the evidence is that lots of them help middle-class incomes decrease, I've got some real problems. And even further, I'm very skeptical about enforcement in these deals. It seems to me we sign these deals, we go right to the letter of WTO. The other countries thumb their nose at WTO, say, take us to court, and we lose. It took 4 years for WTO to rule on China's rare earth monopoly, and they captured the globe in that time. It's a never-ending battle with South Korea dumping steel pipes and tubes into our market. While all the litigation goes on, our people get clobbered and our workers lose jobs. India regularly waives patent rights on pharmaceuticals. We seem to shrug our shoulders. The enforcement mechanism is powerless. So I'm exploring proposals to combat intellectual property theft by countries like China and streamline adjudication when U.S. businesses are taken advantage of by state-owned monopolies. And I hope you'll work with me on some of these ideas. If you're going to have any hope of gaining support for this agenda from many of us on this side of the aisle, not all, the administration needs to prove to us and to the world we're going to start fighting back. We need concrete, predictable, and unilaterally, that's a whole new world, unilaterally enforceable mechanisms in place to show the world that we're going to protect our workers and our economy. Let's start with currency. A bipartisan majority of both Senate and House have made it clear we want strong and enforceable currency manipulation language enacted as part of any TPP agreement. But it also must deal with those countries not part of the TPP agreement, particularly China. Now, I know you can't have that in the agreement, but we can have two things go alongside one another. And I, for one, as China continues to manipulate currency, throwing millions over the years of American workers out of jobs unfairly, don't want to go forward with another trade agreement if we're not going to finally address this issue. And in all due respect, Secretary Liu is great and he talks to me, but the administration hasn't done very much here. They've never called China a currency manipulator when it's plain as the nose on your face that they are. And Japan and other countries, part of TPP, distort their currency exchange rates to push up their trading surpluses. And I'm disappointed to hear your response to Senator Grassley that that won't be part of the TPP negotiations. It has very real consequences for jobs in the middle class. A study by the Peterson Institute of Economics found that foreign currency manipulation has cost America between 1 and 5 million jobs. According to Economic Policy Institute, eliminating currency manipulation will reduce the U.S. trade deficit by $500 billion, increase annual U.S. GDP by $300 to $700 billion, and add between 2.3 and 5.8 million new jobs. I've long been the advocate here. 2003, I was, I think, alone when I talked about this issue, and I was very proud when both the Wall Street Journal and New York Times editorial pages condemned me for it. Now people have come around and said currency manipulation is real, but we still don't do anything about it. Okay? Administration after administration, unfortunately yours as well as President Bush, have taken the position that the issue can be dealt with, as Senator Grassley said, by country-to-country negotiations rather than legislative changes. Well, not for this senator. We've had enough of country-to-country negotiations for over a decade under Democratic and Republican administrations. So I want to make clear, I can't support a TPP agreement if we do not at the same time enact new statutory law that includes objective criteria to define and enforce against currency manipulation. I will not support moving this trade agreement forward if we're not fighting to make sure we have the necessary tools to protect the American middle class and American jobs. You wouldn't go to a game of baseball where your team only got 2 strikes per bat and the other team got 4. If we enter into TPP without strong currency language, that's exactly what we're doing.
Senator, your time is up.
And I'm just finished.
That's a miracle. No, I thought you made a lot of
all things come to those who wait.
I'm very proud of you, I'll tell you.
Well,
Mr. Ambassador,
well, first of all, thank you.
You'd care to comment on Senator Schumer's comments.
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on this issue and on enforcement more generally, and we very much look forward to working with you on it. I will say the following. This administration has taken enforcement very seriously. We brought more cases than ever before, than any other country. We brought 18 cases before the WTO and the first 421 case against China. We have won every single case that has been brought to conclusion, and we're continuing to work to bring additional cases wherever we find that there is a problem to be had and where we can make a case and win. And so we look forward to working with you. We've set up the Interagency Trade Enforcement Center, which has allowed us to bring more resources from across the government and have a whole government approach to trade enforcement. That has allowed us to bring more complex and more sophisticated cases. We look forward to working with you on the kind of enforcement actions that could be taken going forward, because we agree with you completely that it's important that it's not 2 strikes and 4 strikes, that if there's a level playing field, and that we do everything we can under our laws and consistent with our international obligations to enforce our trade rights.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'd like to join Senator Grassley in expressing my appreciation for your outreach on both the TPP negotiations and TPA. I have to think that if other members of the administration followed your good example in terms of letting Congress know what's going on, seeking input, that would be a lot more productive working together, as I hope will be. I don't share the ambivalence that the senior senator from New York has about the benefits of these trade agreements when you consider the fact that 80% of the purchasing power in the world lies outside our shores, and selling our manufactured goods and things we grow and produce here in America to those markets abroad seems like an unequivocal good thing for the American middle class and for our economy and economic growth. I want to ask basically 2 questions. One really has to do with something outside of your immediate purview, but it's something I want to make sure you're aware of, and the other is it falls squarely within your purview. As you know, there's been a prolonged labor dispute out on the West Coast that has resulted in a lot of our exports, particularly of our beef, pork, and poultry, to Asia, to basically sit rotting on the docks there at the Port of Oakland and other locations. U.S. exports over 200,000 metric tons of beef, pork, and poultry a month to key Asian markets. And of course, in 2014, it was roughly $8.4 billion that cleared West Coast ports. So I know that the federal mediator has now gone to try to facilitate negotiations there, but even if that dispute in the Port of Oakland was concluded tomorrow or today, it'd take 30 to 45 days to clear the backlog. And I just would like to hear from you whether you know whether the administration views resolving this dispute as a priority.
Well, I understand, as you suggested, that the parties to the dispute have asked for federal mediation, and that federal mediation is now happening, and we do hope that it will be successful and we'll get this resolved as soon as possible.
Well, I appreciate that. I hope you will carry that message back that this is a matter of grave concern to some members of Congress and presumably all who represent constituents who are engaged in selling poultry, pork, and beef to Asian markets, and and who recognize the important impact that has on our economy. Conversely, the negative impact it would have if they start rotting at our ports on the West Coast. The second issue has to do with the critical importance of protecting intellectual property for biologic medicines in the TPP. As you know, the founders of our great country thought it was so important to protect our intellectual property in terms of advancing science that there's provision, Article 1, Section 8, known as the copyright clause in our Constitution. Yet a number of the countries we're negotiating with basically offer zero protection to the intellectual property rights in their countries. And I'd just like to hear from you about the administration's commitment, particularly on the issue of biologic medicines, to making sure that the 12 years for data protection in particular is included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations.
Well, Senator, we've got 40 million Americans whose jobs depend on IP-intensive industries, and certainly a key part of what we're doing in TPP is to promote strong intellectual property rights, including strong enforcement of those rights, as well as access to medicines consistent with the bipartisan consensus that has emerged here over the last several years. On biologics specifically, as you suggest, there are, of the 12 countries in TPP, 5 countries have 0 years, 4 have 5 years of protection, 2 have 8 years, and we have 12 years. And so this is one of the most difficult outstanding issues in the negotiations. We're continuing to make the case with our trading partners about how data protection can lead to greater innovation around the region, greater investment in this area, how to achieve access consistent with promoting strong intellectual property rights, and we're continuing to have that dialogue with our trading partners.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Appreciate your good work, and we look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you. For the chairman, I will announce that Senator Cardin is next, and after that, it looks like Isaacson, Coates, and Carper. Senator Cardin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to join the praise to you, Ambassador Froman, for your consultation with us, your working with us, the open way that we've been able to work together and share views and share the challenges we have on a trade agenda. So I very much appreciate the manner in which you have involved us in the process. As Chairman Hatch pointed out, we have a challenge, and the challenge is that TPP is so far along the way. Normally, we would have had a TPA enacted. We would have voiced our negotiating objectives. You would have come back to us with consultation on those trade objectives, negotiating objectives, and we would have had a chance to adjust our expectations along the way. Well, TPP is so far along the way that becomes somewhat awkward whether TPA really will work in the way that it was intended to work with congressional input. I mention that because you know my number one concern. My number one concern is in TPP that TPA has very strong negotiating objectives as it relates to good governance, as it relates to anti-corruption issues. We are dealing with countries that are challenging in TPP. Brunei, where the LGBT community has legitimate human rights concerns. In Brunei and Malaysia and in Vietnam, their record on labor is very suspect. And on anti-corruption, they could pass laws, but they don't have the institutions, the independent prosecutors and courts, to give us confidence that they would enforce those laws. So my priority from the beginning, and I think I've been very open about it, is that our trading objectives be very strong on good governance because of the TPP negotiations. And that, yes, we are concerned to make sure that we continue to have a level playing field on environment, on labor protections, but also on good governance, anti-corruption, and, as Senator Schumer said, enforcement. Because if it's not enforceable under trade sanctions, it becomes very difficult to see whether we really elevated. And for those who are concerned, as I know some of my colleagues are, about mixing trade and human rights, let me just remind you that it was U.S. leadership in trade that helped change the apartheid government of South Africa. It was the U.S. leadership that spoke to the Soviet Union and their human rights on immigration through Jackson Vanik that brought about change. It is critically important if we're going to see change in Vietnam and Malaysia and Brunei and other countries that do not have that record, that we use this opportunity to achieve those objectives. So I will be evaluating very carefully, not just what we do on TPA, because we're so far down the line on TPP, also an open process on both TPP and TPA as it deals with human rights and good governance. I want to ask one more question and then have your response on that in the second question. And that is, TPA would deal with more than TPP. It would deal with TTIP, as you've already pointed out. And there's a growing concern with our European partners that they are sympathetic to BDS legislation, dealing with boycotts, divestitures, and sanctions. And I'd be interested as to, in those discussions, whether we have been raising the issues that such action by our European partners would be considered to be against our overall trading objectives, and whether we are using TTIP as an opportunity to protect against such legislation. I'd be glad to hear your comments on both of my points.
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on the human rights and governance issues. TPP, in fact, does have strong governance and anti-corruption provisions in them, and really it's one of the innovations of TPP to make that a core part of the agreement, and it really goes throughout the whole agreement with regard to transparency, regulatory transparency, and across the board, and of course it's got strong enforcement mechanisms generally in the agreement. So we agree with you on the importance of that. TPP has also given us an opportunity to engage with countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei on the kinds of issues that you've mentioned. So with regard to labor rights, for example, we are in deep consultations with these countries about what it would take to bring their labor regime into conformity with international standards, not just in terms of changing laws, as you said, but also what kind of capacity building, what kind of practice is necessary to really have changes on the ground. And it's only because of TPP that we have the opportunity to have that kind of dialogue with Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. And even on the human rights issue with Brunei, which has been raised, we're working very closely with the State Department, which has the lead on the human rights issues, but with the opportunity that TPP gives us to engage with them about their practices and ensure that what they do is consistent with their international human rights obligations. So I feel good that through TPP we'll be able to make progress in all those areas, and that TPP will set a new milestone in terms of good governance, anti-corruption, and improving labor rights across the board. On the European issue, I'm not familiar with that particular area of legislation. It's not something that's come up in our negotiations yet, but we're happy to follow up with you and look into it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Welcome, Ambassador Froman. For Senator Cardin's benefit, I was with Ambassador Froman in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia 2 years ago on the AGOA negotiations with the AU and watched him hold Swaziland accountable for workers' rights as a participatory requirement of the United States in terms of AGOA. And so I've seen this man firsthand look out for exactly what you're talking about. And might add that MCC compacts have the strongest anti-corruption language of any agreement the United States has. And I think the fact that TPP is talking about including that is a big benefit because it has worked in the Millennium Challenge. It has held people accountable that in the past have not, and that was an excellent and outstanding point. And you do a terrific job. I'll pile on with Cornyn and with Grassley and the others to thank you for the job you are doing. But I have a couple of questions for you. Question number one is, you and I have talked a lot about poultry. I traveled to South Africa a year ago with trade rep, or not trade rep, but industry representative, I think his name is Davies. I met with at length in Johannesburg. Yesterday, he was quoted as saying that there's an offer on the table regarding poultry between South Africa and the United States, to the extent that as a negotiator you can talk in public about that. Is that a misleading quote or is that an accurate quote?
I saw Minister Davies a few days ago in Switzerland. He handed me a letter from the South African Poultry Association to the U.S. Poultry Association. We have not yet heard back from our Poultry Association what their reaction to that is. But we've made very clear to South Africa that resolving issues around poultry is going to be critical to moving ahead a whole range of areas, including AGOA renewal.
Well, I appreciate that because that is very important to my state of Georgia. But Senator Coons and I of Delaware have joined together in a joint letter, which you'll be receiving when you get back to the office, reinforcing our position that you use the opportunity of AGOA and the leverage that it brings with the South Africans to be sure that we break through the impasse regarding poultry. And with regard to enforcement that Senator Schumer was talking about, I think nobody's mentioned it yet, but your work with India and the case we took to the WTO in India in terms of poultry proved to be very successful. We just recently run that particular ruling, and I thank you for doing that. On commodities, there's another great product of my state, and it's cotton. Cotton was at 80 cents to 85 cents a pound not too long ago. It's 55 to 57 cents a pound now. China is basically buying cotton and hoarding it and stockpiling it, and they're subsidizing their producers at twice the world market price. What can be done with China to enforce through the WTO or through any agreements we might otherwise have to keep them from manipulating the cotton prices and suppressing the cotton market?
Well, I think this is a very important point more generally, which is that the whole pattern of agricultural subsidies has changed a lot over the last 10 or 15 years. When the Doha round was first started, the focus on agricultural subsidies was really the United States and the European Union. But in both of those areas, subsidies have come down, while subsidies from China and India in the agriculture area have increased. And by some measure, China is now the largest subsidizer of cotton. And so we're engaging with them, and we had conversations also in the last couple of days about that and about taking a fresh look at where subsidies are being provided, how it's distorting the market, and how that should play into global trade negotiations. We think it's important that we update our view of where subsidies are coming from and what impact it has. If you're a poor farmer, subsistence farmer in Africa, it doesn't matter whether the subsidy is coming from the U.S. or from China. It matters that the subsidy exists. And so we're hoping to engage with China on this and to create some disciplines around this.
Would that case have standing at the WTO if a case was brought?
We're looking at all of our options there. We have not yet determined whether there's a case to be brought in that area.
One last point with regard to poultry. I was in Brussels shortly after a trip you had made, and I repeat again the respect the European negotiators have for your ability and your engagement. But one of the problems we've had in terms of market access is, on the one hand, the Europeans will talk about giving market access, for example, to poultry. But on the other hand, they'll say, but we won't take any poultry that's washed with hyperchlorinated water. Well, that's the way it's produced in the United States of America, whether it's Delaware or Georgia or Texas or California. They use the regulation to be the barrier to not the product. Or what are you doing in the negotiations on TTIP to try and avoid that type of thing happening again?
Well, you put your finger on it, because market access is not meaningful if it's just talking about tariffs and not talking about the other barriers that can exist. And our perspective on this with regard to Europe is that we don't want to force, we're not interested in forcing anybody to eat anything. But we do think the decision about what's safe should be made by science, not by politics. And we're encouraging them to ensure that decisions on SPS standards reflect science, reflect the evidence, and is based on safety.
Thank you for your service to the country.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Welcome, Ambassador. It's great to see you. And others have already said this, but we very much appreciate your responsiveness. And frankly, your short, crisp answers are welcome, too. I was talking to one of my sons earlier today. I got two boys, 24 and 26. And when they were little kids growing up, I used to say to them, they'd make a mistake. And I say, there's nothing wrong with making a mistake. Let's just make sure we don't make the same mistake over and over again. And they're probably better at not making the same mistake over and over again than I am today. So I think it's sunk in. NAFTA's been mentioned here before today. If we had to negotiate NAFTA all over again, we'd probably do some things differently. And the point that you made earlier today is that we do have the opportunity here to negotiate NAFTA, at least in part, maybe in whole, I'm not sure. But just drill down on that particular issue. How do we, people say NAFTA hasn't been all that helpful to the U.S. It's been, I think, arguably very helpful to Mexico. They have a vibrant middle class today. There are probably as many Mexicans going into Mexico as there are Mexicans coming into the U.S. today. And there's, I think it's arguably been pretty good for the Mexicans. Not entirely bad for us, but sort of a mixed bag. In terms of one of the issues mentioned by Senator Isaacson, poultry, we have a real problem in NAFTA with Canada, as you probably know, and that's one that we can fix. But just drill down on the things that what we know now about NAFTA. What can we do differently, and what are we going to do differently with respect to the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership?
Oh, well, thank you. Look, NAFTA was 22 years ago, and as you said, there's a lot that we've learned from that experience and the experience since, and there's a lot that's changed in the global economy and the global trading system. So first and foremost, I think one lesson we've learned is that labor and environmental issues need to be core to the agreement. They need to be fully enforceable, just like any other provision of the trade agreement, and that's exactly what we're doing through TPP, but not just with Canada and Mexico, with 40% of the global economy. So we're spreading those enforceable labor provisions to over 500 million workers around the world. And that reflects a very meaningful evolution of the global trading system. When labor and environment were once considered to be literally side issues, now they're central and they're going to be fully enforceable. It's also given us an opportunity to go back and address market access issues that we couldn't address in NAFTA. We are still negotiating. We have a ways to go, but we've made clear, for example, as you said, on poultry with Canada, that this is an area that we're going to want to see progress in TPP. And there are other issues that have arisen since. Some of the intellectual property rights issues that have evolved over time, or the digital economy issues that have emerged since that time, before there was an internet economy. This gives us an opportunity to renegotiate and update our approach in all of these respects.
All right, thank you. Senator Schumer raised some serious concerns about enforcement mechanisms. There's an old saying, justice delayed is justice denied. And I think you mentioned that we've brought about 18 or so cases to the WTO. Those that have been resolved in our favor. Could you just give us a breakdown of out of the 18, how many have been resolved and how many are still outstanding?
I believe 7 have been resolved fully through the process, all of them in our favor. We just recently won the case with Argentina on import licensing. As Senator Isaacson mentioned, we won a case on poultry with regard to India. They're now appealing that case, but we have won up to now. We feel confident in our approach. Some of the others we're trying to resolve through consultations to settle the case, and we're waiting for the other ones to make their way through the system.
All right. Is there something that we need to do in the Congress in order to expedite the amount of time it takes to resolve these issues?
Well, I think the key thing is with TPP, we're able to have our own dispute settlement mechanism among TPP countries. And we have a very strong dispute settlement mechanism that we're negotiating with our partners, and one that has got firm timetables and schedules, and which we hope will find expedited resolutions.
All right. The reason why Senator Isaacson, yours truly, Senator Cardin, Mark Warner continue to focus on poultry. It's a huge industry on the Delmarva Peninsula. We have in Sussex County, Delaware, we only have 3 counties in Delaware. Sussex is the 3rd largest county in America. We raise more soybean there than any county in America, and we use the soybean and the corn that we raise on the Delmarva Peninsula to raise all of those chickens. The outnumber is 300 to 1 in Delaware, and we want to make sure that we can sell them to as many markets as possible. The last thing I want to say, I just wanted to reemphasize a point made, I think it was by Senator Cornyn, on biologics, and you and I had an opportunity to discuss this earlier this month. Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, other states, New Jersey, literally right along this row here, have huge interests. A lot of tens of thousands of jobs that depend on our ability to have a fair settlement, a fair agreement with respect to biologics. And I would just continue to raise that issue with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Senator Coates, I apologize. I passed over you to call on Carper. I didn't mean to do that. Thank you very much for being patient for me. So I call on Senator Coates, and then it would be Thune, Roberts, in that order.
Mr. Chairman, no apology needed. I'm happy to yield to my friend and colleague from Delaware.
Are you one?
I'm trying to, I'm new, I'm trying to figure out the rules here in terms of, I rushed over to be here on time, get my name on the list. You saw me, I had to go out and make a quick stop at another place and come back. And then I thought, oh, I got the rules wrong. Must go back and forth between parties. That's fine with me. Any event, I appreciate your apology, not necessary. Ambassador, thank you, first of all, for diligent work on a very tough subject, but a very important issue for the economy and for the future of our country and for many, many people from my state and from many states that rely on trade for their well-being and their lifestyle and for our economy. In Indiana, we are a big export state. Getting this right means a great deal to many, many Hoosiers, several hundreds of thousands, approaching 1 million, whose jobs are there because we're able to export agricultural products, steel, auto products, pharmaceutical products, medical devices, and a whole range of other products that are produced in my state. So I wish you nothing but success. I am a strong supporter of trade. I want to affirm that some of the reservations that have been expressed here by my colleagues relative to making sure we have a level playing field and we've established the rules and they're accepted and enforced will be important. But my question to you is this. At the State of the Union, one of the things that brought Republicans to their feet faster than anything else that the President said was his announcement that he wanted to go forward to gain trade promotion authority and move these trade agreements forward. To get this done, in my opinion, based on my experience, it's got to be an all-in. It's got to be above partisan politics. It's got to be done in a bipartisan way. There have been some reservations raised about proclamations from the White House in terms of what they'll support, what they won't support. And then I want to just make sure that, you know, we're all in. If we're all in, we can get this done. All in means that Republicans and Democrats need to work together here in this committee and in the Ways and Means Committee in the House. Our colleagues have to work together to bring this home, and the President and the administration. Can you affirm to us that the President is all in on this, that the administration is all in, that you have the support you needed from your administration in order to work with us to get this accomplished?
Yes, Senator. Though the President has made clear publicly and privately, and he's been meeting with folks privately as well, but we also have a structure now at the White House organizing a whole of administration effort involving virtually the entire cabinet to promote the overall trade agenda, talking to members about TPP and what's in TPP and addressing their concerns and their questions, and talking about the importance of moving ahead on a bipartisan basis with trade promotion authority as well. So I have a great deal of support from the President on down. It's a priority for him. We want to work on a bipartisan basis, make sure we're addressing concerns of Democrats and Republicans as we move this forward.
Well, I'm happy to hear you say that. I think the voters in November sent a very strong message to all of us on both sides. Get it done. Get something done. I think this ranks very close to the top in terms of things we can get done that will make a measurable improvement in terms of economic growth and providing jobs for people. So thank you for that. Wish you nothing but the best, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Thune.
Mr. Chairman, Senator from Kansas has been waiting. I'd defer to him first. He's after me.
The ranking member. Who? Oh, Senator Roberts, I'm sorry.
Well, I want to thank Senator Thune, and that is remarkable that you would do, well, it isn't remarkable. As a matter of fact, I just appreciate it. Senator Coates has pretty well summed up what I was going to say at the first of my comments, and so I would just like to reiterate that this committee is all in. And you've heard that with a strong statement from Senator Hatch. You heard it with a strong statement from Senator Wyden, who represents the great state of Oregon but was born in Kansas. And you heard it with pertinent questions from Senator Grassley. Senator Grassley asked you this, and this is of interest to the Chairman Emeritus of the sometimes powerful Senate Agriculture Committee, Senator Stabenow. A package soon on agriculture. What soon?
Well, the market access negotiations are proceeding in parallel with the negotiations over the text, over the rules. And literally as we speak, our negotiators are meeting with the other 11 countries on both sets of issues. The market access negotiations on agriculture are done on a bilateral basis, so we meet with the other 11 countries one-on-one and have our areas.
Well, I know that, but what's soon? What do you think?
Well, look, I
know it's hard to predict, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
I mean, our view is that obviously the timetable should be set by the substance, but we think everyone is focused on trying to get this done in a short period of time, in the next small number of months.
All right, you say that, but here we have. I'm not going to Schumerize you now. I'm going to, I want to, some questions back and forth. The GIs, the USTR, you have really made issue on this issue with China at the end of the year, making our argument on trademarks much stronger. But we had 43 members of the Senate write you a letter on the GI issue, the geographical indicators, by prohibiting the use of common generic food names such as Parmesan and bologna and feta. Thank goodness we don't have an Italian community named cheese. Last year, I wrote to you along with the 43. I want to thank you and your negotiators on their steadfast support. But where are we on that on the GIs?
Well, this is one of the toughest outstanding issues still in TPP because we and the EU have diametrically opposed positions. Our view is that our system works well for Europe. There are 18 trademarks for Parmesan Reggiano in the U.S., and Europe sells hundreds of millions of dollars of cheese in the United States, and we don't sell any in Europe. And so we have been out there fighting hard to make clear that we can have a system where countries can take into account common names and trademarks before they grant any geographical indications, and that's the only way to balance the perspectives of the United States and the EU. Our challenge is our trading partners are negotiating with us, but they also want to negotiate and want to have good relations with the European Union. And so they're stuck in the middle, and we're trying to find a middle path that will protect our trademarks and those common names.
I appreciate that. Let me bring up the biotech situation. There are currently 12 products awaiting final approval by the EU's College of Commissioners. The queue is growing. More concerned, the new European Commission announced its intention to conduct a review of the entire European biotech import approval process. There's concern that the 12 products pending final import approval will not advance. The EU is like calling for instant replays on every play, and that's just not going to work. Would you comment on that, please?
Well, we share that concern. We've raised it in our meetings with the European Union. I've had now 3 meetings with my new counterpart, the Trade Commissioner. We've made clear these are products that their own European Food Safety Agency has determined are safe, and that they have an obligation under the WTO. They have an obligation even under their European Court of Justice decisions to move ahead with these approvals, and we're encouraging them to move ahead as quickly as possible.
I'd just like to repeat, thank you for answering these questions. I'd like to repeat what Senator Coates said again. I think we have a unique opportunity here, and you've done some excellent work, and I thank you for that. I think you know that every member of this committee is behind you. Each of us have our own initiatives that we're interested in. But I worry that the President, State of the Union, 7 veto messages, but as Senator Coates said, we were on our feet on the trade issue to help the middle class, as Senator Schumer said. So we're in. I know you're in. Hope the President is. And I thank you for the job that you do. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Now, Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Froman, thank you for your efforts to engage the Chinese and agricultural biotech issues over the last year. It's critically important to American farmers, and echo and associate myself with the comments from the Senator from Kansas and the Senator from Iowa who spoke to this issue earlier, both with regard to China. And I want to continue to emphasize how important those efforts are. And then also with the TTIP agreement with the EU, it's going to be very hard, I think, to get that agreement through unless we give American farmers more certainty with regard to the approval process for biotechnology products. So anyway, I want to make that point. I also wanted just to speak to an issue. Last year in Brookings, South Dakota, we had welcomed the opening of a state-of-the-art cheese plant by Bell Brands USA. It's a 170,000 square foot facility, employs 250 people with the hope of more in the future, especially if we can bring down what are very high barriers to U.S. dairy products in Canada. As you know, Canada's dairy market was not sufficiently open as part of NAFTA, and many of the tariff rates on dairy products range from 200 to 295%. So I want to strongly urge you to continue pushing on our friends of the North when it comes to market access for cheese and other dairy products, and I guess I would appreciate any thoughts that you might want to share on that subject.
Well, this has been a high priority for us, and before Canada joined TPP, we had a dialogue with them about this and how this was going to be an important part of a successful outcome. We are engaged with them on a whole range of outstanding issues, and they know that this is very important to us, and we're working towards hopefully a successful conclusion there.
Okay, it'd be very helpful. I mean, dairy business in places in the Midwest is, especially processing, is really starting to explode in some ways, and we certainly want to see more of that and all the jobs that come with it. But these tariffs are pretty prohibitive. You made remarks last June in which you highlighted data localization requirements as a significant problem for U.S. service companies working to expand into foreign markets and to compete globally. I agree with your view on that matter. I'm concerned about TPP not fully addressing those types of barriers for U.S. financial services companies such as banks and insurers. And specifically, I understand that TPP won't explicitly prohibit our trading partners from requiring U.S. financial service firms to set up local data centers as a condition of doing business in their markets. That's a serious concern. And I'm wondering if your office can work with mine to correct this oversight and to ensure that this omission is not repeated in other trade negotiations such as TTIP and TISA.
We're happy to work with your office on that. We are continuing to pursue our efforts to put disciplines on localization and to ensure a free flow of data across borders, but we're happy to work with your office on that.
Yeah, well, it's a big issue, and you know, the Europeans in particular, it's an area that they're really, for reasons unrelated, I think, to trade, really trying to create some of these barriers, and I think that would be a big mistake and certainly make it more difficult for a lot of our businesses, service industries, and financial services being a good example to continue to do business in that part of the world. Could you just quickly comment on, it's an issue I brought up with you before about the EU's decision in February of 2013 to impose a 10% duty on ethanol, and what steps USTR is taking to bring that case to the WTO?
Well, we've engaged in dialogue with the EU about that. We have not yet resolved it. We're hoping to, with the new commission in place, to re-engage with them on this and as part of our overall discussion in TTIP about areas of cooperation to try and bring that to a conclusion as well.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would echo what's already been said. We really need to get TPA done, and I hope that the President talks about it in State of the Union address, but we really need the administration engaged up here, trying to help us as we push this across the finish line. Thanks.
Good. Senator Casey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Froman, thanks for being here. Thanks for your service on a tough issue, which we all have deep concerns about as it relates to not only our states but the country overall. I wanted to start with a premise or a foundation upon which I will make determinations about these agreements, and that is that in my home state of Pennsylvania, despite promises and assertions in the lead up to trade agreements, too often our state has gotten the short end of the stick. We can debate how that happened, we can debate the reasons for that, but I have real concerns and real skepticism, which I know we've talked about. And at the same time, when it comes to what I call the short end of the stick, either job loss or dislocation or workers not getting kind of basic fairness when it comes to these agreements, that's bad enough in and of itself, but then they see very powerful and well-financed special interests in this town especially, but in other places as well, who don't get the short end of the stick. They do quite well. So I have that concern, that skepticism, and frankly, it's more than a skepticism, it's real worry. And then when we come to the question of, well, okay, let's try to mitigate that somehow by remedies, trade remedies that play out in the trade cases that are brought. And even when we're successful, it seems that we're never where we ought to be as it relates to those workers. So I have real concerns, and I know you understand that the playing field never seems to be leveled when it comes to our workers. And I know earlier you spoke in answer to a question from the panel that the improvements to labor rights or environmental protections or IP standards. But the question I've got to get to is a question of jobs. Just when you look at the context of China, here's just some data. Between 2001, when China joined the WTO, in 2013, just roughly 12 years, the trade deficit with China increased by $240 billion, or $20 billion a year. When that plays out for Pennsylvania, we rank 5th in total net job loss, or net jobs displaced, I should say, by trade with China. So how do you answer the question that these agreements and the path that you're on is good for workers in Pennsylvania?
Well, thank you, Senator. You know, Pennsylvania's goods exports are now $41 billion. They've grown by 150% over the last 10 years. More than 200,000 Pennsylvanians are employed by export-related businesses. 15,600 firms export from Pennsylvania. Almost 90% of them are small and medium-sized businesses. And the question is whether through these trade agreements, we can create more opportunities for those kinds of businesses. You talk about China and the trade deficit. If you take all of our FTA partners as a whole, we have a trade surplus, and that surplus has grown. Our trade deficit, as you note, is largely comprised of countries with whom we do not have trade agreements. So trade agreements are our way of shaping forces of globalization, of opening markets, because our market is already quite open. Our average applied tariff is 1.4%. We don't use regulations as a disguised barrier to trade, but other countries do. And if you just look at Pennsylvania's exports, look at sort of the 5 top areas of your exports. Chemicals, 35% tariffs in some of these markets. Pennsylvania exported $5 billion of these products. Those tariffs will go to zero. Minerals and fuels, 30% tariffs in some of these markets. Pennsylvania exported $4 billion of these products. That tariff will go to zero. Metals and ores, 35%. And it goes on and on and on. What we're going to do through this trade agreement is open up markets and then level the playing field so we can protect workers, protect American jobs, and then ensure a fair and level playing field by raising labor and environmental standards, raising intellectual property rights standards and enforcement, making sure that we're putting disciplines on the type of practices, for example, by state-owned enterprises that pose a real threat to workers in Pennsylvania.
Well, I have no doubt about your intention. The problem is that some of this we've heard before, and you mentioned some industries or some economic sectors in our state, but when I look at whether it's sugar or solar panels or furniture or tires or paper, or probably the best example would be steel, which is iconic as it relates to our state. We've had time and again promises made prior to trade agreements, and then efforts after the fact to bring enforcement cases that have never been commensurate with the promise that was made. And I would argue that as much as I know you want to level the playing field, I would hope we could level the playing field long before we have trade agreements in place. But we'll continue to talk, and I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you, Senator. We'll now go to Senator Portman.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your being here, Ambassador Froman, and I thank you for what you do every day and what your team of professionals do to open up markets for the workers I represent and the farmers I represent and the service providers I represent. We had some discussion earlier from some folks in the audience about how this affects people who are frustrated about the lack of wage growth, concerned about whether they're going to have a job at all going forward. And all I can say is, I think you just answered the question well with Senator Casey. If we are not selling to the 95% of the world outside of our borders, we're letting our people down. And we do have relatively low barriers here, as you said. But the rest of the world has a lot of barriers, and that's not fair. And so what you do every day to knock down those barriers is what we want more of. And I'll give you one example. We got a little company in Akron, Ohio. You guys worked with us. We just opened up the Japanese market for them for their processed meat product. They were getting shut out. And these are workers in Akron, Ohio, who now have a chance to have a job. And as you said, these jobs pay on average 18% more. They also have better benefits. The agreements that we talked about today, people say some agreements are good, some are bad. I'm sure we can improve all the agreements that we've made. But the reality is that we send 45% or more of our exports to 10% of the world because we only have trade agreements with 10% of the world. We don't have a trade agreement with China. We don't have a trade agreement with Japan or Europe. And we got a surplus with these countries. And we got to figure out, a better way to open more markets. It's unbelievable to me that we haven't had the ability to open any markets since 7 years ago because Trade Promotion Authority expired. Every president since FDR has had the ability to open up markets by trade negotiating authority until this president. And he's now asked for it. We as Americans ought to say, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, whatever, we want our president out there opening up markets. During those 7 years, there have been over 100 trade agreements negotiated. We're left out all of them. You mentioned China. China has negotiated plenty of agreements. Out of that 100, China at least has 14 of those agreements that they've negotiated during that time period. Maybe some of them came just before that, but around that time period. One of them, by the way, is with 10 different countries. And we're not part of it. So our workers are getting left out. And I don't know how we're going to make progress in terms of affecting this concern on stagnant wages, lack of benefits, high expenses, unless we do a better job of selling to those countries all around the world. And we don't do a good job. I mean, our exports per capita were somewhere between Tonga and Ethiopia, I think. Nothing wrong with Tonga and Ethiopia, but we're not a big trader. We're just not. We are, I think, looking at a great opportunity here to expand trade if we can get this negotiating authority done, do it in the right way, and continue to make progress on leveling that playing field. We've also got to do a better job on imports coming in. And as you know, you've been very helpful to me on this. We have a couple good successes, one with China, one with Korea and other countries in the last year alone on tubular products. These are steel pipes we make in Ohio. We want to keep making them. We don't want unfairly subsidized imports coming into our country, and that's what's been happening. So it's a balance here. We've got to both get more exports out there, but also do a better job of making sure that imports are being fairly traded. I've got so many questions for you, more than half a dozen. I'm going to submit most of them to you for writing since we don't have time to go through them today. But they're all about Ohio workers and Ohio farmers, Ohio service providers who want to know what more can we do to open up more markets to them. 25%, a quarter of manufacturing jobs in Ohio, factory jobs are now export jobs. We want that to increase because these are good paying jobs. I will ask you one question, and it's one that will put you on the spot. Again, having said how much I appreciate all you've been doing, there's one that does concern me, and that is currency. And when I was sitting in your seat, I got asked by Chuck Schumer, who spoke a little earlier. He did give me a chance to respond before his time was up. And this was, gosh, almost 10 years ago probably. But he asked me about currency. And I said, yeah, I think it does affect trade. And it affects it negatively. And I know it's not your bailiwick in the sense the Secretary of Treasury has responsibility for currency. But I would just ask you today, does this new report by Larry Summers, former Secretary of Treasury, and other finance ministers from around the world that says, and I quote, new trade agreements should explicitly include enforceable disciplines against currency manipulation that appropriately tie mutual trade preferences to mutual recognition that exchange trade should not be allowed to subsidize one party's exports at the expense of others. That's what it says. Does that affect your thinking on this, and what are your views on currency and what we can do in trade agreements going forward?
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you for so much leadership on trade and for being a great source of advice and guidance. Currency is of great concern to us, and it is a top priority. There's no difference of opinion about that. We think it's important that countries move towards market-determined exchange rates, that there's not a misalignment of exchange rates. And the Treasury Department, the President, everyone on down has been focused on that bilaterally with countries like China, where after pushing them to move their currency in June 2010, they began to let their currency appreciate, and it's appreciated about 15% in real terms against the dollar. Not fast enough, not far enough. We need to keep on pushing towards full market-determined exchange rates, but we are making progress in that area. When Prime Minister Abe came in Japan, the G7 finance ministers got together and said, you know, you may want to stimulate our economy, but you've got to do it through domestic actions for domestic purposes. And the Bank of Japan has effectively done so. It's had an effect on currency as well, but they've done the same kind of thing that our Federal Reserve did with quantitative easing. So I think it's important that this is a very important issue. We need to find the right ways of achieving the results. We're fully committed to doing that in the administration. There's a wide range of views, I know, in Congress, even on this committee, about how best to go about addressing the issue, and we're looking forward to continuing that dialogue.
Okay, I know my time is up, but I would hope that you will put some time and effort into it. I know, again, it's a Treasury issue, but the issue is intervention. And I do think that currency is something that more and more of us on this side of the aisle and that side of the aisle certainly are going to be concerned about, because it does affect trade. It affects our ability to have that level playing field we've talked about today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Stabenow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do want to talk about currency. I know that's no surprise. And I do want to start by saying, last Congress, as you know, a significant bipartisan majority, 60 senators sent a letter to you, and 230 representatives signed letters supporting the inclusion of strong and enforceable currency disciplines in all future trade agreements. But before I get to that, I would like very much to raise something that came up this morning in the press. And first of all, thank you for your enforcement. Thank you for continuing to have dialogue. I appreciate that. And I do appreciate the aggressive posture of the administration on enforcement. I care very much about agriculture, as you know, but I also care very much about manufacturing and about automobiles. I don't think we have a middle class unless we make things and grow things and sell things, sell both of those. The key is to export our products, not our jobs. That's the fundamental debate, exporting products, not jobs. And right now, as you know, 70% of our trade deficit with Japan is autos. And this morning, as reported in the Detroit News, based on Asian reporting, we understand that the administration, they're saying, will end negotiations with Japan on standards for car imports in exchange for Japan's agreement to import more U.S. rice. I'm all for importing more rice. When you and I talked earlier, you indicated that the auto negotiations were totally separate from agriculture. When we look at the fact that today we couldn't put an American automobile in a car dealership in Japan, they won't even allow that. You know all the restrictions in terms of we can't sell to Japan right now. And so first I want to know whether or not this is true, that you have decided not to proceed in opening up the ability for us to sell automobiles into Japan.
Well, Senator, one thing I've learned in this job is not to believe everything you read in the press, and particularly the Japanese press. And it's categorically wrong. We are continuing to pursue the parallel negotiations on autos and to address the non-tariff measures, including standards, financial incentives, regulatory transparency, and having strong and effective dispute settlements around that to make sure that we can make sure that Japan upholds its obligations.
Thank you. Well, that's critically important. So let me go on now to currency. All we're asking for is internationally accepted principles in currency that countries have all agreed to be enforceable in trade agreements. And over again, we've had conversations, you and I. You know the numbers. We're talking about anywhere between $6,000 and $8,000 per vehicle, the price of a vehicle coming in. We've seen numbers where at various points the Japanese automakers have made more off of manipulating currency than other profits on selling automobiles. I mean, this is a huge issue in terms of not having a level playing field. We're talking about millions of jobs, anywhere from 2 million to 5 million jobs, if we were, in fact, to enforce what everybody knows is potential at various points. They may not be doing it right this minute, but we know what they have done with the Bank of Japan. We also know that with Korea, with China, with others that we are involved in with this agreement, that this is a major issue. So where are we on this? And are we going to see enforceable currency provisions in these trade agreements?
Well, look, as I've said, this is a priority issue for us that the administration and the Treasury Department in the lead has been addressing since day one. We have been pushing countries to level the playing field by moving towards market-determined exchange rates. We've been using bilateral engagement, for example, with China, where I think we've made some progress. We have been using our engagement through the G7, the G20, the IMF. I know you'll have Secretary Liu up here as early as next week, and I refer you to him for further discussion of it.
Well, let me just stress again, as you know, this is an absolutely critical issue in terms of making sure that American workers and American people are getting a good deal on trade agreements. And so far, I've not seen anything, any indication that, in fact, we will see currency issues addressed either in TPA or TPP or other agreements, and that's a serious flaw. So I would encourage you to continue to do everything you can and to actually give us some specifics.
Thanks, Senator.
Thank you.
Your time is up. Senator Bennett.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this hearing. Ambassador Froman, thanks for your efforts. Thanks for being here today. I know you've touched on this in the hearing today, but and I appreciate your mentioning Colorado in your testimony and the importance of exports there. Nowhere is that more important, really, than in our agriculture sector, which we export roughly $2 billion a year. It's hugely important to our state's economic well-being. Our state's wheat growers export 80% of what they grow, and even through droughts and the tough times that we've had, they've continued to grow. About a year ago, Senator Grassley and I sent you a letter. I know he touched on it generally, but I wondered if you could offer some more details. Sent you a letter to urge you to negotiate in a strong fashion with Japan to make sure that market was really open to our beef producers, to dairy, to wheat. And I wonder whether you'd speak in more detail to where you feel you are, what are the hurdles that remain, and what do you hope to achieve in the coming weeks in the closing of your negotiation?
Well, thank you, Senator. We have been engaged with Japan in agricultural market access negotiations really since almost the better part of a year now. And it's been an ongoing process of going through the 1,800 tariff lines of agriculture, including their sensitive products, what they've identified as what they call their sanctuary products, and working with them and our stakeholders to, first of all, get agreement that all products will be covered. So even beyond our agreement with Korea, all products will be covered in our TPP agreement with Japan, and then to go line by line through those products to maximize the number of products where there can be full tariff elimination, and where there can't be full tariff elimination, to have a dialogue about how to achieve commercially meaningful market access for our stakeholders on their priority issues. And that's the process we've been going through. I think we've made substantial progress in a number of areas, but we still have work to do to complete that. Those discussions are ongoing.
Well, I think that certainly in my case, the outcomes there are going to be really important to deciding whether or not to support this going forward. How do they include the sanctuary products in the products that are part of the negotiation?
Yes, all products will be covered. It's a question of how, and that's where we have worked very closely with our commodity groups, our stakeholder groups, to get the best understanding from them as to what their priorities are and what can create commercially meaningful market access for them.
Well, thank you for the work you're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me a chance.
Thank you so much, Senator. I think we've completed the round, so maybe I can ask a question or two, and then I know you have a few questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ambassador Froman, last year I expressed my concern that despite Russia's serial violations of its WTO commitments, you have not brought a single case against Russia in the World Trade Organization, or WTO. Now, this is despite the fact that the administration told Congress during consideration of PNTR that one of the major benefits to having Russia in the WTO would be our ability to bring them to dispute settlement. Could you explain why you have not brought a case against Russia?
Well, we've been exploring all the various issues around areas of trade friction with Russia. We've been consulting with other parties, such as the European Union and others. All the options are on the table. We are considering how best to address the outstanding issues and where to devote our efforts. So it's an area that we are keenly focused on, but one not yet that we have brought a case on.
Well, I suggest that you consider that. It's very important that the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement provide for transparency and procedural fairness in reimbursement decisions regarding medical devices and pharmaceuticals. These are crucial elements which build public trust in national health care systems. And I consider strong provisions addressing transparency and procedural fairness in reimbursement decisions crucial to the strength of the final TPP agreement. And I understand that some countries, such as Japan, may be resisting these efforts. What are you doing to ensure that strong provisions will be included in the agreement?
Well, we are working with our trading partners, but also our stakeholders here to have a transparency provision that is based off of U.S. law and U.S. practice, the national coverage determinations process that applies to Medicare. Nothing that we're doing is going to affect is going to require any change of U.S. law. It's not going to affect Medicaid or veterans benefits or anything else in our system. It's taking the national coverage determination kind of process, as you say, the fairness and due process, and encouraging other countries to have that as well. It doesn't affect the level of reimbursement that a country might decide on. It simply makes sure that an individual can raise a request that a medical device, for example, be covered by their national health system. And we think that kind of procedural due process, it would be a positive development in this region, and we're continuing to negotiate on that.
All right. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, is an opportunity to improve upon the already deep relationship between the world's two largest financial markets, the European Union and the United States. Now, do you agree that the inclusion of financial services framework, including regulatory cooperation, is an essential part of a successful comprehensive TTIP?
Our view is that financial services are a key part of our transatlantic relationship and should be part of this trade agreement, as in any other trade agreement in terms of market access. In terms of regulatory cooperation, this is an area where there's been an explosion of activity since the financial crisis, whether it's in the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee, the G20, or bilaterally. We have a bilateral dialogue with the EU over financial regulatory issues that the Treasury Department leads on behalf of our regulators. And our position has been that that's where we ought to make progress in parallel alongside TTIP on financial services regulation by looking at and strengthening existing mechanisms.
Thank you. Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, I want to talk to you for a couple of minutes about the importance of a free and open internet. It is obviously critically important to the economy, but it's also a platform not just for commerce, but for the free exchange of ideas. And of course, there have been a lot of battles, a lot of them waged in this room, to come up with the policies that will ensure that the net stays free and open. I know that years ago we were faced with the challenge that if you owned a website, you could be held liable for something that was posted on the site, which would have pretty much meant that you wouldn't have had social media because nobody would have been comfortable investing in it. So what I'd like to hear briefly is how you're going to make sure that nothing in these trade agreements will undermine an open internet. In effect, our challenge here is to buttress what we've accomplished in the United States to keep the net free and open, and then do everything we can to build those principles into discussions and agreements we're having with our partners. And I don't think I'm the only one who feels strongly about it, and I'd be interested in your views on that.
Well, look, that's exactly right, Senator, and that's exactly our perspective. We view TPP as an opportunity to bring into the digital economy fundamental principles from the real or the physical economy, including the importance of the free flow of information and data across borders and maintaining a free and open internet. So what we're pursuing in TPP is based on the approach that has been crafted here under U.S. law, including around issues like ISP liability or around technology protection measures or around copyright, making sure there's strong copyright laws, but at the same time, this is the first trade agreement that in history that we'll put forward that allows for exceptions and limitations to copyright consistent with U.S. practice. So our approach has been very much consistent with that approach.
I just think that millions of internet users want it clear and they want it straightforward that nothing is going to be done to undermine an open internet and particularly buttress the victories that have been won here and look to overseas opportunities for the same kind of policies. Let me get into one other area, and that is the relationship of TPA to TPP. And suffice it to say, there are a fair number of people in Washington scratching their head trying to think through the relationship. We all know that TPA basically tells the president here, in effect, are the negotiating objectives for a trade agreement. And so people say, okay, that's what TPA is about. Then they open up their morning newspaper, and the morning newspaper says that TPP is pretty much done or close to being done and the like. I think it would be helpful as we wrap up to have your sense of what are the outstanding issues still left in the Trans-Pacific Agreement, and how does the procedural issue, the Trade Promotion Authority discussion, impact what is still being discussed in the Trans-Pacific Agreement?
The TPP is really two parallel negotiations, one on market access and one on a set of rules. So on market access, as we've discussed here, we've made very good progress, but we still have remaining issues, whether it's in agricultural access to Japan, Canada, a few other markets, or resolving manufacturing tariffs in a few countries, or in the services area, what we call non-conforming measures. And so we have bilateral negotiations with the other 11 partners to resolve those issues. On the rules side, we've made very good progress and continue to make progress this week in terms of closing out various issues. But there are, I'd say in the intellectual property rights area, still a number of open issues. In the environmental area, still a couple of open issues. Some in state-owned enterprises and investment. And those are all areas where we've been working with our partners bilaterally and in groups to try and find appropriate landing zones to close out these agreements. In terms of the relationship with TPA, we have, in the absence or the expiration of TPA in 2007, notwithstanding that, we have worked with Congress to ensure that we are consulting throughout the negotiation and getting input from this committee and from other members about what should our negotiating objectives be. And we've benefited enormously from that give and take and that feedback. And I feel confident that as we work in parallel on completing TPP, consistent with the high standard, ambitious, comprehensive objectives we set out, and securing TPA, consistent with the work that has been done and continues to be done to try and build bipartisan support, that we will be able to achieve those objectives.
Ambassador, thank you. That's helpful. And suffice it to say, I'm sure you're going to get that question in other forums, too, of the relationship between TPA and TPP. What I'll tell you, your answer also enforces something you and I have talked about, and that is the more information you can make available in a fashion that's understandable to Americans, the more likely, particularly middle-class families who've been skeptical of trade agreements, are going to say this makes sense. The days are over when the American people are going to say, hey, they can just go negotiate this thing, we'll take their word for it. And I think that last point just reinforces how, as these discussions go forward, how important it is to make the information that's available to the public and to do it in an understandable fashion.
If I could just comment on that, Senator, we completely agree. And our objective is to achieve maximum transparency, and whether it's with Congress, stakeholders, or the public, consistent with being able to negotiate the best possible agreement. I would say that this morning, for example, we've launched a new website as part of our continuing effort to increase transparency. We've added a number of features to increase the accessibility and facilitate communication between the administration and the public, including a new TPP information center on the website. And this is just one step. We can always do a better job of being more transparent, and are committed to working with all of you to determine the best way to do so.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ambassador, for your testimony. Before I start my line of questioning, I just want to say I think you're one of the brighter lights in the administration and certainly very responsive, so I appreciate your responsiveness on so many different issues. Now, I know this question has been asked, and I've been in between hearings and trying to glean from the TV and meetings your answer, but I still don't quite get it. And that is, you say you need fast track from Congress to provide you with marching orders for negotiations, and that it puts Congress in the driver's seat, yet the TPP is almost complete. So I'm not quite sure how it is that the things that some of us who might contemplate supporting TPP but would want to see in TPP ultimately make an effect if your negotiations are almost in place.
Well, the Trade Promotion Authority that I believe this committee and Ways and Means have been working on, of course, is broader than TPP. It encapsulates TTIP, it encapsulates agreements that we might negotiate at the WTO. It's intended to be not just for this agreement in this year, but for a longer term
I get
prospect.
that, but TPP is first up at bat, and that's almost finished.
And with TPP, it's one reason why we've spent so much effort consulting with Congress, both this committee, Ways and Means, but also the membership more broadly, to get input throughout on what they'd like us to see negotiate on it, whether it's on the digital economy or state-owned enterprises, market access, labor and environment. Those are all issues that through our consultations with this committee and others, we've been able to put on the table in our TPP negotiations, and I'm confident we'll come up with a positive result.
All right. You know, some of us are very concerned about strong labor provisions, given the inclusions of countries like Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia, just to mention a few. And so, but that's all going to come, in my perspective, after the fact. So this is one of my concerns. What's the use of TPP if you got a deal done? Let me just join those colleagues, I think including the chairman, who have talked about intellectual property rights, which is a critical issue for our country. We lead the world in this regard, and we see it stolen very often with impunity. And particularly as part of that, in a state like New Jersey, which is the medicine cabinet to the world, the question of pharmaceutical intellectual property, including the goal to have 12 years of data protection for biologics with TPP as currently stipulated in U.S. law. I know you've talked to that, but I just want to make it very clear to you that this is a critical issue in my consideration of either TPP or, for that fact, any individual trade agreement. And if we cannot protect, at the end of the day, the intellectual property of our companies, and if we cannot give them a reasonable time to recoup their investment after they make billions of dollars in research, sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't, then it's a real problem. Let me ask you one other question. Getting the details right in TPP is particularly important because the agreement, as I understand it, will feature a docking mechanism that allows other countries to join in the future. Korea, China, Taiwan are potential newcomers. How's that docking mechanism going to work? For example, will the ascension of China in the future require a new trade promotion authority or any other role for Congress, or will they be able to dock and accede to such an agreement that's already in place?
Well, as you suggest, Senator, the TPP is intended to be a platform to which other countries who are able and willing to meet the high standards could potentially join with the consent of all of the countries around the table, and that consent has to reflect their domestic processes as well. So no country would be able to join TPP without Congress's involvement and approval.
So each future country that wishes to accede to any agreement that would be had would need individually Congress's approval?
We need Congress's approval. That's correct, sir.
And finally, on CAFTA, several of our current free trade partners in Central America have raised concerns that if the final TPP includes concessions requested by Vietnam regarding rules of origin and short supply lists for textile and apparel, it will result in severe job losses and potentially gut the textile and apparel industry in the Western Hemisphere. As someone who is very concerned about our challenges already with Central America, its stability, its prosperity, and as we saw last year in those who seek to flee their country because of instability and whatnot, this would be an enormous blow. How do you intend to deal with that reality?
We've worked in the textile area through the yarn forward rule, the short supply list, rules of origin, and customs enforcement and cooperation to take those issues into consideration. And we've been working very closely with our textile manufacturers in the U.S. who are part of this supply chain with Central America to get our best understanding of what their sensitivities are and to take that into account in our negotiations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, how are you today? Quick question for you on the ITA. As conversations continue surrounding the expansion of the WTO's ITA, China has recently agreed to include multi-component semiconductors into the agreement. This is a huge step forward as China is one of the largest importers of semiconductors and could represent hundreds of millions of dollars for the U.S. semiconductor industry. Considering the importance of the MCO agreement to the U.S. And to the ITA, what is the USTR's plan to bring the ITA to completion?
Well, thank you, Senator. We reached a significant breakthrough with China in November along the lines that you said, which allowed us to restart the ITA negotiations in Geneva. We've made some progress there, but there are remaining issues, particularly between China and Korea. And we're encouraging both parties to come to the table to negotiate. We are each trying to create enough benefit for all the parties on the table to sign on to the agreement, and we're encouraging China to show flexibility in accommodating some of Korea's interests in order to bring ITA to a close. As you know, it would be a significant agreement for the U.S. and for the world. It would cover $1 trillion of trade. It's estimated to increase global GDP by $190 billion, including 60,000 jobs in the U.S., and so we are very focused on trying to resolve the remaining differences.
Thank you. During the State of the Union, the President asked both parties to come together on TPA, and we've heard lots of conversation today about TPA, and it certainly is something that's important to my state of South Carolina, without any question. Perhaps one of the states that would benefit the most from such an agreement would be South Carolina. But when I look at the President's record as it relates to negotiating on behalf of the nation, I turn my attention to things like the Iran sanctions negotiations, where we've seen delay after delay after delay. I think about the freeing of folks who want to, dangerous terrorists who really seem to be bent on killing more Americans, or the deal with China on carbon emissions. So we're going to work towards a 15-year timeline, and theirs really doesn't start until 2030. And so my question to you is, what type of confidence, while I realize that it has to come, but the agreement comes back to Congress for approval, my question to you really is, what kind of confidence should we have on the type of deals that will be structured going into the future with TPA?
Well, we're consulting closely with this committee and other members of Congress throughout the negotiations and with stakeholders and with the public to come back with the best possible agreement for the U.S. And I think we have a strong record of doing that, including, for example, when we were renegotiating Chorus to deal with some of the auto issues, the President walked away from the negotiation because the deal wasn't good enough. And 3 months later, we got a much better deal, and we were able to bring it back to Congress and get it approved with strong bipartisan support. So that's the model that we use. We want to bring back strong agreements that promote jobs in the U.S., strengthen the middle class, promote growth here, help create good, well-paying jobs across all the areas, manufacturing, services, agriculture, that levels the playing field. We're protecting American jobs and American workers. We're creating a fair and level playing field by raising these standards and making sure that they're fully enforceable. And one thing that's very important is we really are facing an important choice here, because we're out there trying to work on an agreement that reflects American values and American interests. And to us, that's the greatest prospect of supporting and protecting American workers and businesses here. But there are others out there negotiating agreements that don't have these kinds of protections, whether it's labor and environment or intellectual property rights or state-owned enterprises or a digital economy. And it's critically important to American workers and American businesses that it's the U.S. that leads and that we don't cede that role to another country.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator. I want to thank you, Ambassador Froman, for your good testimony and for being with us today. I want to thank all the members who asked questions today and to everyone who was also able to attend the hearing today, even our noisy friends at the beginning of the hearing. The hearing record will remain open for 48 hours for any members' written questions. And with that, you'll be happy to know, Mr. Ambassador, the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hey, Fast Track, you can hide, we can see your corporate side. Hey, Fast Track, you can hide, we can see your corporate side.
TPP is going to be a next crisis. Let me look at my bag. Get your bag. Get your bag and step out. TPP is going to exacerbate a environmental crisis. You don't understand that? You shouldn't vote on it.